Okay, so today is actually a unique day on the Jewish calendar. Part of the topic for the class today is going to be about drawings and art in the Megillah, and one of the considerations is whether or not it distracts the people from listening to the Megillah. So I've given you some pictures of art today, and now we're going to see if it's going to distract you from listening to the class. But before we get to the topic at hand, I want to mention just a little bit about today. So today is a unique day in the Jewish calendar, and in order to explain why, I'm going to back up a second. This year is a leap year. That means there's 2 months of Adar. There is the way it works when you match 2 Adars into 1 Adar. Comes out a little bit interesting. So, for example, in 13 years from now is not a leap year. Neither is 12 years from now, actually. Any math people over here? Today we're in the 8th year of the 19-year cycle. The 8th year is a leap year. In 13 years from now will be what year of the 19-year cycle?
21.
It doesn't go to 21. After 19 it resets to 1. So it's going to be in the 2nd year. Right? So the 2nd year of a leap year is in 13 years from now. Is not a leap year. And the 1st year is also not a leap year. So anybody born this year is going to have the bar bas mitzvah in a non-leap year. That's, if Mashiach comes and we go back to renewing the month, the whole system of the Beis Din, so then the calendar is much more fluid. In fact, there's actually, on Twitter, there's this like theme that you have people who adopt personas of different times and eras, and they post as if they were living then. There's a guy I follow, there's these guys who pretend to be biblical personas and, stuff like that. So there's a guy who I follow who his persona is, he's a Kohen serving in the temple in the second Beis HaMikdash. So this morning he posted on Twitter, public PSA, whatever, it's in Hebrew, I forget exactly the words. This year is a leap year. Tomorrow is Rosh Chodesh of the 2nd Adar, not Rosh Chodesh Nisan, right? Because back in the day, when they had the calendar decided by the Beis Din, they didn't necessarily know so far ahead of time if it was going to be a leap year or not. And the absolute deadline, even though ideally it was done earlier, but the deadline to decide was yesterday, you had to decide, is tomorrow going to be the 1st of Nisan, or tomorrow going to be the 1st of the 2nd Adar? And could you imagine not knowing, we don't know if you're 2 weeks away from Pesach or 6 weeks away from Pesach, right? In today's lifestyle, that would certainly be a very stressful way to do things. But back to the topic at hand. So the way the calendar is scheduled, we, in 13 years from now, will not be a leap year. And so, for example, let's talk people we know. Chani just had a baby boy on Thursday, which was the 28th of Adar 1, and it's 6 weeks before Pesach. When that boy is bar mitzvah, his bar mitzvah is going to be on the 28th of Adar. There is no Adar 1, Adar 2, right? So he is going to be bar mitzvah on the 28th of Adar, and it's going to be 2 weeks before Pesach, right? Now, what about a boy that's born tomorrow? Tomorrow is the 1st of Adar Sheni. So that boy who's born tomorrow is going to be bar mitzvah 4 weeks before Chani's son, who was born 2 days ago. Right? Okay. That's all in general the sort of anomaly, if you will, of Adar Rishon and Adar Sheni. Today is even more anomaly. It's a unique day, and that is it's the 30th of Adar 1. Why is that so unique? Because Adar 2, or in a regular year Adar, doesn't have a 30th day. So if somebody is born today, if you hear anybody having babies last night to today, their birthday is, so in a leap year, their birthday is going to be on the 30th of Adar 1. In a non-leap year, when is his bar mitzvah? How do you define what today is? Is today the day after the 29th of Adar? Well, in a non-leap year, the day after the 29th of Adar is the 1st of Nisan? Or do you say today is the day before the 1st of Adar, because tomorrow is the first of Adar. So is today the day before the first of Adar, in which case in a non-leap year that would correspond with the last day of Shvat, the 30th of Shvat. Right? So that's a big machlokes. If somebody is born today, is their bar mitzvah on the 30th of Shvat, or is their bar mitzvah 31 days later on the 1st of Nisan? So that's just today in Jewish and Torah. One of the famous people in Jewish history who was born today is the Ksav Sofer, the son of the Chassam Sofer, the Sofer family, where they lived in Pressburg, which today is, I'm pretty sure, in Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia doesn't exist today. It's in, is it in Slovakia or Czech? Czech. I don't know. It's in Pressburg. So the Sofer family, they were also known as the Schreiber family, because Sofer is Hebrew for a scribe, a writer, and Schreiber is scribe in Yiddish or German. So the Schreiber family were a very prominent family of generations of rabbis, and the ancestor of the family is really the Chassam Sofer. They also come from Rabbi Akiva Eger, the father-in-law of the Chassam Sofer was Rabbi Akiva Eger, so very prominent, famous poskim. And then the Chassam Sofer's line, his son was the Ksav Sofer, who was born on the 30th of Adar 1, and also continuing a strong line that's still around today of prominent rabbis, and there's many customs that are attributed to Chassam Sofer. It's like a very sort of, like you have different customs of different Hasidic groups. So, the Chassam Sofer group are not Hasidic, but there are certain customs and styles of, of songs and minhagim, etc., that are connected to the Chassam Sofer's family. Personally, I'll share a cute anecdote. So last week we spoke about Tzavos Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. And if you recall, I quoted the Tshuva of the Tzemach Tzedek, where he talks about the instruction of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid that you shouldn't marry into the same family twice. You shouldn't have two brothers married to two sisters, right? So, and the Tzemach Tzedek says that he wasn't concerned about that. He himself married off two of his children to siblings. So when I was, many years ago, spent some time in Lugano, which is in Switzerland. It's on the border of Italy. And there used to be a very flourishing Jewish community there anymore. There used to be a very flourishing community there. It's not there anymore. There is now a Chabad Shliach there. But the Frum community that was there for many years basically doesn't exist anymore. But over there was a Jew, but there was two brothers, I think, who I met. But there were some Jews there by the name of Schreiber, and they were descendants of this family. And so there was, if I recall correctly, the guy who we met there, he was telling the story about his parents. That his parents were, his mother and her sister both married two brothers who were Schreibers. This same idea that we mentioned last week. And the Schreibers were a prominent rabbinical family. His family were a prominent Jewish family who were affluent. And so that was usually the case, that rabbinic families either married into other rabbinic families or into wealthy families. And so for the first shidduch, when this person's aunt married his uncle, right, then the first of this family, maybe it was a Rubenfeld family, I'm not sure, married a Schreiber, the Rubenfeld family gave the chassan a very big nadan, as we call it, a very big dowry, because you were marrying into such a prominent family that came with a price tag. Yeah, it's a little bit foreign to modern sensibility, but that was the way it worked.
Pay up. You gotta pay up.
Yeah. Huh? So fine. So then, however many years later, there's a second shidduch of the same, the sister of the original Kala to the brother of the original chassan. And so the Pressburger Rebbitzin, Mrs. Schreiber, she's assuming, just taking for granted, that we've already established the price for this, so the same price all over again. And the Tzad HaKala, the Kala's family said, last time when you did the shidduch, you were just marrying Joe Schmo. It was a nobody, so we had to pay up. This time, you're marrying into the mechutin of the Preshberger Rav. so now we've already gained our status, and anyway, so that's. By the way, once I'm on the topic, I'll just make a couple of small corrections to things that I said last week. First of all, the Rishima that I was quoting, which I accidentally said that it was written by Rebbe and Rivka about her life. It was not written by her. It was written by her grandson, by Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, by the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe. Things that he wrote about his grandmother, things that he had heard from his grandmother, etc. So that's just one correction. Also, the other detail which I was a little bit hesitant about has now become more clear to me, that indeed the Rebbe Maharash was, at least to one extent or another, against the shidduch. He was hesitant or ambivalent about marrying his niece. To what extent he was ambivalent and why he was ambivalent, and if in the end he came around and yes or no, that's already unclear to me, and a little bit, of course, whatever, it is what it is. But I just want to correct that. Okay, there were maybe some other things to correct as well, but those were two things that are right now in my mind to, so to speak, set the record straight. And now we move on to the topic for today's class, which, as I mentioned before, is artwork in the Megillah. So, first of all, a little bit of history. Once upon a time, before the printing press, so who had books? Wealthy people. Wealthy people could afford to hire a schreiber, to hire a transcriber to write your books and to create manuscripts. So they would have books. It was a wealthy, an expensive thing to have, and there used to be a lot of artwork in part of the. You want like today you would say you want a beautiful book, you make it leather bound. Let's say, right? You want to get something beautiful. So how do you make something beautiful? So you hire an artist. Maybe it's the same person as the scribe was also an artist. And so we find many, many old books that have machzorim and things like that have artwork in them. And in fact, for example, this is mentioned in Shulchan Aruch. In Shulchan Aruch, in Siman Tzadik, or Chaim Siman Tzadik, in chapter 90, and I'm going to read it for you the way it's in the Alter Rebbe records it in his Shulchan Aruch. He talks about artwork in the shul in general, and he says that it's not a good idea to have artwork on the walls of the shul or etc. because it could distract people from prayer. And then he says, "V'lachein," and so too, or so, therefore, "Ein nochin gamkein letzayir tziyurim b'sfarim shemispalim behem." It's not a good idea to print pictures in the books that you daven from. Shelo tisbat la'kavana, so it shouldn't distract you from having proper kavanah, from focusing on your prayer. Now, nowadays, I think the idea of artistic sidurim is almost non-existent, unless you're in first grade kids. But the reason for that is because all of these pictures and artwork in the books kind of fell to the wayside with the advent of the printing press. Because once the sefer wasn't unique to me, I have the same sefer that everybody else has, so there was less of a sort of motivation to want to invest money in making pictures in it, because putting the pictures in the printed book doesn't make it unique. I have the same picture, right? Just think about a leather-bound book, right? If all the books were leather-bound, exactly the same, then that wouldn't be special. What makes it special is that I buy you the same. Everybody else has the siddur with a regular gray cover, and and I chose a specific leather cover that's unique. And I come in your siddur, nobody else has a siddur that looks the same as yours with this color and this design on the leather, etc. Right? So what happens is, after the advent of the printing press, art in Jewish books became limited only to Haggadahs. Haggadahs still had artwork, and it's interesting to discuss why that would be, but possibly to keep people engaged in the Seder and shouldn't fall asleep, right? And the only other thing which we find artwork in, and the interesting thing is that we don't find this from before the printing press, is Megillah. Megillah Esther, the scrolls of Esther. Megillah just means scroll, but we use the word Megillah to refer specifically to the scroll of Esther. And basically around the year Shin Chaf Daled, which is now with Tav Shin Pei Daled, so that's 450 years ago, 460 years ago. What's that in the English years? What's 2024 minus 460? No.
17.
16.
124
Minus 460. 1564, right? So around in the 16th century, that's when we're starting to find these old Megillahs which have art in them, some samplings of which you have on the papers in front of you. And so, the shaila becomes, is it okay to be putting these, is it okay, al pi halacha, can you use artwork, a Megillah with artwork for the mitzvah of the Megillah? Now, it's one of the interesting questions that comes up over here is, to what extent can we look at history or at artifacts from history to paskin halacha? Meaning the fact that we find that these Megillahs exist, does that automatically tell us that the rabbis of the time okayed it or not, right? By the way, it's interesting that in this article over here from Professor Spiegel, so Professor Spiegel is a Talmud Chacham and also a historian, and he's published here tshuva from a rabbi who's not very well known. His name is Reb Moshe ben Reb Menachem Matratzina. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. This is the earliest source that we know of somebody addressing this question, and we don't know exactly when the date that the tshuva was written. But we know that the dates of this rabbi are, he was born in the year somewhere between 1555 and 1565, and he passed away in 1623. So this tshuva is the earliest source on this topic that we know of, and it's written in the late 1500s to early 1600s. And so that's in a prominent source, and he actually is lenient about it. He does allow art in the Megillah. But obviously the reason we don't find it discussed before is because it didn't exist before. It was only after the printing press that suddenly Megillahs, which were the only scroll that people actually had handwritten, personalized, that it made sense, so to speak, to adorn it with this artwork. So it's personal taste. And of course there's also a mitzvah of Zeh Keili V'Anveyo, to beautify a mitzvah, and you could argue maybe that this is in fulfillment, in line with the spirit of beautifying mitzvahs, to make it, to put artwork, who knows. So the question is, what's the halacha about this? So, other than this tshuva which Professor Spiegel publicized, traditionally in traditional halachic works, the first work that addresses this is the Eliyahu Rabbi. The Eliyahu Rabbi is Rabbi Eliyahu Shapiro, who lived in Prague, and let's see if we could pull up his dates quickly. His dates are, well, it says here that he passed away in Tuf Ayin Beis, which I'm going to think is 1633, I think. No, 1632. Yeah. No, Shim Pei Gimel is 1623. No, it's much later. Sorry. He's much later. He's a century later. Wow. Yeah, the Eliyahu Rabbi is much later. He is, Tov Ayin Beis is going to be 1712. Tov Ayin Beis is 1712, right? So, the Eliyahu Rabbi, he writes like this. Nira, it would appear, the Gam HaTziyurim She'esim Begilyonis, also the pictures that people make in the margins, Ein Enochin is not correct. Why? Because ideally we want the Megillah to be like a Sefer Torah, of a Sefer Torah Pshita Da'asar. And Sefer Torah, obviously this is forbidden. What does he mean by this? So, Megillah has this complicated dynamic, that on the one hand the Megillah is referred to as a Sefer. In the Megillah itself, it refers to itself as a Sefer, and also refers to itself as a Nigeris, a letter. What's the difference between a Sefer and a Nigeris? Well, there's certain criteria for a Sefer and there's certain criteria for a Nigeris. I guess you could boil it down by saying a Nigeris a letter is something which is less formal and has to less conform to certain rules, and a Sefer has certain criteria that make something be a book. The idea of the Megillah, so we have this balance, to treat it like a Nigeris, which is more loose, or to treat it like a Sefer, which is more rigid in rules. So the Rishonim bring, it's quoted usually in the name of Rabbeinu Tam, that because the Megillah is referred to as a Sefer, therefore it has the same requirements as a Sefer Torah, at least ideally. So any laws that we find in a Sefer Torah, we gotta, or for that matter, in Tefillin and Mezuzah, in some areas, right? We're going to apply the same to Megillah, at least lachatchila, meaning, if we say a Sefer Torah must have A, then we're going to say ideally a Megillah should also have A. But the Eved, if the Megillah has A anyway, we're not going to disqualify the Megillah necessarily. But lachatchila, we're going to try and copy Sefer Torah. Igeres, the reason why we're going to okay but the Eved is because it's like so we have this sort of double-edged attitude towards the Megillah. On the one hand, trying to copy the Sefer regulations; on the other hand, treating it less formally. By the way, just so you'll notice there's a custom that we fold the Megillah into three. The reason why we fold it into three, whereas when you read from the Sefer Torah, you're reading it in the shape of a scroll. With the Megillah, you're folding it up like a paper, which is supposed to emulate more how you would read a letter rather than how you read a scroll. Also, unlike a Sefer Torah, which has atzei chayim, it has like a stick on the end of it, right? A Megillah, there's different opinions about this, but I think the more prevalent custom is not to have a stick on the Megillah, and it's also spoken by the Poskim for that reason. Anyway, so back to this case, the Rabbi's first point is that because a Megillah is supposed to emulate a Sefer Torah, so just like in a Sefer Torah you don't put anything in the margin, so you shouldn't put anything in the margin in a Megillah either. And then the second thing he says is Gam also. Sorry?
What's that? What do you put in the margin? You said you're not supposed to put something in the margin?
The art. He's talking about the art.
Oh, the art. Okay.
Yeah.
You were referring to the Torah.
No, he's saying the opposite. And just like in the Torah, you don't put anything in the margins. Right. So too should you not. He's saying against art. He's against art.
That's like a Mishnah Sofrim or something.
A Sechta Sofrim.
There is in halacha that a Sefer Torah cannot have.
Well, that's good question. Good question. It does say beferish that it does say explicitly that the Sefer Torah has to have margins of a certain size, and then there's two things. Now there's two questions. One is, are you allowed to add anything in the Sefer Torah? You're not allowed to add anything into the Sefer Torah. So if you add pictures, is that considered adding? And the other question is, if you add pictures, does that take away from the sides of the margin? That the definition of margin is empty paper, right? So if you put artwork there, then you're compromising the margin hood of the margin, right?
That was one of the features of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that they had all this commentary on the margins of their
Really?
Torah. I think
That's so interesting. Okay, but I didn't know that, but just at face value, that wouldn't mean anything, because that could have been scrolls that we're using to learn from, not necessarily scrolls that we're using as quote unquote a kosher Torah, right?
I think Lauren Schiffman said that.
Right. But okay, the Rabbi says another reason, but let's flesh out this one a little bit first. So, what else is there about adding into the Megillah? So, for example, in the Sefer Torah, there's a rule. This is clear in the Sefer Torah that you're not allowed to add vowels or trup into the Sefer Torah. Can you imagine how much easier that would make my life if right? If the Sefer Torah had all the punctuation and the cantillation notes. Right, exactly. So we take away the business from all the Bali Kriya. Anyway, so that's why they pay me the big bucks. But right. So that you're not allowed to have in the Sefer Torah. What about a Megillah? Are you allowed to put in the trup in the Megillah? By the way, here we're talking about putting it in with ink, right? Then there's another question. What about penciling it in? Okay, but so that's a machlokas. So the question is why. It's clear that you're not allowed to do so in the Sefer Torah. The question is why, and the why might also impact why you shouldn't do it in the Megillah. There's a number of reasons given. One is because aim lemikra, aim lemasayis. That means that sometimes there's only one way to read the word, but there could be other ways to vowelize the word, and we might sort of Chazal may expound on both. Sometimes we translate the word in multiple ways, following variant vowelizations of that very same word. Additionally, another reason the Rashba brings is that you're not allowed, that you have to give the Sefer Torah exactly as it was given from Sinai, exactly as God gave it to Moses, so you can't add in anything. So this second reason, l'chayra, certainly would not apply to Megillah, because Megillah is not part of what God gave Moses at Sinai, at least not in the literal sense of the word. So L'maisa in Shulchan Aruch, it says, this is in Siman Tov Reish Tzadik Aleph, chapter 691, Sif Tes, number 9, Megillah shehi nekuda, a Megillah that has vowels in it, and similarly, if in the first column you wrote blessings or poems, Ein if Salas Bekach does not become disqualified by this. And the Mishnah Berurah says, and if there's nobody who knows to read it with the trup, with the musical cantillations by heart, Mutter Lichtev Gam HaTaimim B'Megillah is that you're even allowed to write not just the vowels, but also the trup, the notes, in the musical notes in the Megillah. However, it's clear that it's not ideal. It doesn't say you're allowed to do it. It says it doesn't disqualify the Megillah. And in practice, I think we all know that this is not the practice. We don't usually put in, certainly not with ink, but nobody puts in the trup or the vowels into the Megillah. So that's question one. The question one is, to what extent is a Megillah the same as a Sefer Torah, and to what extent would that forbid adding in text into, art into the Megillah? Now, in addition,
When you say the Megillah, it's the actual scroll. Are we talking about a sefer, a book that has the Megillah in it, or are we talking about?
We're talking about as of now. I'm talking about the scroll.
Scroll. Okay.
Yeah, that's the pictures I gave you. Are pictures of very old Megillah scrolls handwritten on parchment. These are scrolls of the Megillah handwritten on parchment with artwork in the margins. Right? Now, we could also, another differentiation to be made might be between general artwork and artwork that has words on it. So, for example, in the picture, I believe that if I recall correctly, I gave to Ari, let me see it, turn it around a second. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's that picture. You could see that the artwork isn't just art, it actually includes words, right? So, for example, there were some Megillahs that have words from the book of Shmuel, I believe, where it describes something about Shaul HaMelech, who's the ancestor of Mordechai. So, does adding words to the Megillah, is that, as part of the art, is that even more egregious than adding art itself? That's another thing that the Poskim discuss. Right, so that's written about Shalom, right. You might bring to mind also the Rambam, we've spoken about this before, about people who used to add texts into the mezuzah, right? So our custom today is that on the back side of the mezuzah, we add the name of Hashem Shin Daled Yud on the outside of the mezuzah. So when you wrap up the mezuzah, that's the part that you see, but it's not written on the mezuzah itself. We only have Shema V'Hayim Shemaya. But there were ancient customs which the Rambam vehemently opposes, but clearly others were supportive of it, that on the actual mezuzah, in the margins of the actual mezuzah, they were adding in divine names of angels, and all sorts of other sort of amulets for protection into the mezuzah. Now we paskin that would that would disqualify the mezuzah if somebody wrote things into the actual mezuzah itself. So to what extent does a Megillah have to emulate the other, Sefer Torah, mezuzah, etc., in the sense of not adding any words? So here we saw explicitly in Shulchan Aruch that you are allowed to add, at least not ideally, but at least b'diavad, it would be okay if you added the bracha, that's words, right? But that would be before on the first column. And then also the margins. What about the size of the margins? So do all these things matter? So that's one issue with the Megillah. And then secondly, he says that, going back to the Eliyahu, his second issue is, additionally, it could be compared to what it says in Siman Tzadik, which I read to you before, that it's forbidden to put pictures in the siddur that you use to daven. However, says Eliyahu, perhaps we should not compare a Megillah to a siddur, because in siddur, when you're davening, it's very important that you maintain proper concentration, whereas in the Megillah, it's not as critical to have such focus as it is during davening. So we avoid putting pictures in the siddur, so you shouldn't get distracted. But what about perhaps perhaps the Rebbe is ambivalent. Perhaps it's not so bad to have pictures that might disturb your concentration in the Megillah. Now here come to the point that Bill mentioned. That what about printed Megillas, right? That you're not using to learn from, you're just using to follow along. So in terms of the status of the Megillah itself, this is printed. Obviously, it's not a kosher Megillah. Which, by the way, side point, this is another halachic shaila that became that was discussed quite a bit in those years at the beginning of the advent of the printing press, and it still once in a while pops up today with new technologies. Is could we ever have a Megillah or a Sefer Torah, for that matter, which was printed, right? We're not talking about a laser printer. Let's say the old-fashioned printer where you have a plate with ink and you stamp it onto obviously it would have to be parchment, not paper, fine. But can you take a plate of the Megillah and stamp it onto the parchment, and then you have your Megillah or your Sefer Torah written? Would that constitute? And the main discussion seems to be, when it comes to writing the names of God, that might be a little bit more, because you need to have special intention, but you could, obviously there's no name of Hashem in the Megillah, but even for Sefer Torah, so you could have the plate leave you the space and add that in afterwards. But the main discussion in the Poskim there seems to be whether or not, whether putting a plate onto the parchment to print it, would that constitute writing? Is that considered that you wrote it or not? So that's another very interesting topic, which, that would be almost an alternate reality Judaism, where imagine tefillin and mezuzahs and all these things could be produced almost en masse just by printing them. Yeah. So that's also another fascinating topic, which maybe we'll do a class on that one day. I'm not so familiar with the topic, I just sort of know that topic exists. But back to our case at hand, so nobody's going to question whether a printed Megillah could be kosher, because it's printed on paper, it's printed, but you're using it to follow along the Megillah. And if the Rabbi is suggesting that you're supposed to have concentration on the Megillah, and we don't want to put pictures to distract your concentration, then maybe you shouldn't follow along in a printed Megillah with pictures either. And on the contrary, he said, there's an interesting halacha. What happens if you're dozing off during the Megillah? If you're sleeping, you're sleeping. But what if you're dozing off, right? So the Shulchan Aruch, it says that it depends. If you're reading the Megillah and you're half dozing off, then you're fine, because the fact that you managed to continue reading it, so that means you've said every word, so it must mean that even though you were a bit drowsy, you didn't actually, quote, fall asleep. But if you're listening to the Megillah and you're dozing off, then we're saying it's no good, because we're going to assume that you actually dozed off and you may have missed some words of the Megillah. And so if we're going to sort of carry that back to our topic, we might even make the argument that it's worse to have pictures in the printed Megillah that you're following along with. It's worse to have big pictures in the Megillah that you're following along with than it is to have pictures in the Megillah that the Baal Koreh is reading from. Because at the end of the day, I'm reading every word loud. Maybe I focus too much on a picture, but at the end I said all the words. Whereas if you're just following along, you might get completely enthralled by a beautiful piece of art and completely miss something. I think Ari made a face before, and I think to all of us it sounds a little bit strange that you should make this comparison to davening. Obviously, davening is all about the focus and the kava and the concentration, whereas Megillah is not like that. And the Rabbi himself is ambivalent. He says maybe not. So that remains an interesting point of discussion. I should point out that there's another relevant halacha in Megillah is about Hagbah. So before and Shachris and Purim morning, before we read the Megillah, what do? What comes immediately before Megillah reading on Shachris? We read the Torah. What happens after the Torah reading?
Megillah.
Before that? Hagbah, right? So somebody does Hagbah, and then he's sitting on the chair here holding the Sefer Torah. When does he put the Sefer Torah back? Before the Megillah or after the Megillah? So Tosfos says, and this is in fact our custom, right? That he stays sitting holding the Sefer Torah through the duration of the reading of the Megillah, and after the Megillah we say Ashrei V'Adat Tzion, and you put the Sefer Torah back in the Aron Kodesh. But the Beis Meir argues on Tosfos, and he says no, that if he's holding the Sefer Torah, he's going to be too focused on making sure he's holding it properly and it doesn't fall or whatever it is, and So therefore, it's better to put the Sefer Torah away before the Megillah, so that the person who does Hagbah should be able to concentrate properly on the reading of the Megillah. So again, here we see this sort of different opinions in that case of to what extent do we mandate sort of absolute hyper kavana when it comes concentration when it comes to the Megillah. Now, I already mentioned. Sorry.
It's so hard. I mean, because the art, I don't know how far back these go, but whenever you look at art, they're telling a story. So now you have two stories going on. You have a story of the Megillah, and you have the story of what the artist is conveying.
Exactly. That's an excellent point, and even more than that, I'll tell you that the pictures that I gave out over here, from what I could tell, they're for the most part all the pictures are telling are all Purim-related stories. But some of the ancient Megillahs that we have, the art has nothing to do with this story. It's just random pictures of birds and stuff, just to quote, make it beautiful, without telling a story related to the Megillah. And we could discuss whether that makes it better or worse. I don't know. And another very interesting thing is, in some of the paintings, and I think, Bill, you have one, I'm not sure if you guys have, when some of the, paintings, in some of these pictures, you'll see that in addition to having art in the top margin and in the bottom margin and even in the middle margin, some of them have artwork within the column that says the 10 sons of Haman in between the right. So you have on the right side, that column is split into two. On the right side you have the names of the 10 sons of Haman, and on the left side you have the S and. Now this is like a poem. It's a shira. For example, some have argued that the fact that it says V'es, 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 which is not necessarily common when you have a list of names of people. In general, in the Torah, in the Bible, in the Torah, when you list names of people, it doesn't usually say V'es, V'es, V'es in between. It just says V. In other words, the prefix Vav is and. Right? S is an additional layer of prefix that we don't have a parallel translation for in English.
It identifies a direct object. So once you say what the subject is, and then you have one of the S, you know everything that follows is a direct object.
Right. Exactly.
It makes sense to do it then.
So if you look through the Torah in general, when you find lists of names of people, it's not going to say the S between each one. And additionally, the halacha is brought to Masechta Sofrim that there's a specific way to write this shira. The way the Masechta Sofrim puts it is Ariach al gabi Ariach Levena al gabi Levena, which I believe there's different interpretations of, but the easiest interpretation and the one that registers it, the one that I remember right now, is that Levena means a big brick, and Ariach means a small brick. So the small bricks refers to the V'esses, that's the small word, and they'll go all neatly stacked on top of each other. And then the Levena, that's the big brick. Those are the names which are, Parshan Dasa, some long names over there. Those are the big bricks, and they're neatly stacked on top of each other. And then that's supposed to take up one column of the Megillah. So now these people have introduced artwork in the middle over there. So does that interfere with the halachic requirement of having the names of Haman with the word V'es on one column, or does that split it into two columns? Another question: Does it interfere with the Ariach al gabi Ariach Levena al gabi Levena, this specific setup that it's supposed to be like the bricks laid on top of bricks, and here you have something else in between? Does that interfere with that? So that's a very interesting additional aspect to the whole artwork situation, which is halachically questionable. It's also interesting to point out that the way they've depicted it in a number of these Megillahs is like a gallows with 10 nooses, one on top of each other, with the 10 sons of Haman hanging on them. According to the simple meaning of the Megillah, reading of the Megillah, and the way the Mefarshim explain, that they were not actually hanged on the gallows; they were just hung there after impaled or hung after they died, after they were killed. They were hung up, sort of as a trophy almost. To the way the Mefarshim say to make everybody fear. Here, look at all these prominent people that we killed. But the way it's depicted here is that they were hung. They were hanged on the gallows. There may be, I don't recall exactly right now. It's possible that in Chazal there is such an opinion as well. I don't recall, but that's just an interesting also to note. We mentioned already about that your one has words in the art, so that's an additional shaila. Now, of course, one of the articles that I read in preparation of today's class is an article written by Rabbi Eliezer HaKohen Rabinovich. I think he's a son of Rabbi Gamliel HaKohen Rabinovich, who's somewhat famous. So very contemporary Haredi style of sort of gathering all there is on the topic, all the different poskim he could find who touch upon it. He also talks about Megillahs that were found which had stamps. Stamps meant, like today you write your name in a book. So once upon a time you had a stamp. If you were an affluent guy who had a library, then you had a stamp, and then you had your stamp in the book. And this is till today in Jewish, what's the word, bibliophilia? Is that how you say that word? People who are into books. There's collector's items, and you go to these libraries and you find a book. And books have multiple stamps because nowadays you just buy a new book. Once upon a time, the books went from person to person, and it could have been owned over generations. And people have stamps, and you can get stamps there are stamps that are considered very prominent because they were famous people or famous rabbis and collector's items. I mean, certain books with stamps can be worth a staggering amount of money just because of that stamp. So, are you allowed to put your stamp with your name on in the Megillah? So all of this is the thing. Now, of course, because we're Haredi, so he says like this. It's also important to point out, even though this is obvious, and I'm translating from the Hebrew here. This is very obvious, and it goes without saying, that it is self-understood that the entire heter, according to those who do allow art in the Megillah, is absolutely only exclusively to put pictures which are tzniastika pictures. Not, God forbid, pictures of forbidden images, and certainly you should be very careful about this when it comes to pictures of Queen Vashti or Lahavdil Queen Esther. Vidal, enough said, meaning you get the point. And to be extra careful, guess what he's going to say? L'chayra, it would appear that ein l'tzayir klal t'munei shel nashim, you shouldn't make any pictures of any women in the Megillah because unless you can't. Anyway, you should avoid all pictures. All pictures of women should be completely avoided. For any more details on this policy, contact your local Mishpacha magazine representative, who will be very happy.
That's not a Megillah issue.
To elaborate on the erasure. What did you said Megillah? What? No, we can't say it. We don't call it Megillah Esther. We just call it Megillah because we can't say that name.
Yeah, I'm very sorry.
All right, and then finally, another interesting thing is that besides artwork, which I'm pretty sure for the most part doesn't exist now, certainly not in Frum circles, but one of the pictures, I think I gave it to you, David Yehuda, you want to bring the picture? Some Megillahs, and this is still common today, have crown artwork. No, maybe you have it. Turn around the page.
Oh yes.
Right? So you might have it also in the back of one of those. Oh, here, no, here, right here. Right? You see that on top of certain words, whether it's the Shin of Achashverosh or on top of Hamelech, where they'll have these sort of extended tagin or some sort of. It's not really art in the sense of depicting a picture of anything, but it's sort of elaborating on certain letters to make them sort of a little bit more festive or. I don't know exactly how you want to describe it, but that still is a practice it's not common in Chabad, but it is common. Certainly with people who have Hamelech Megillahs, there is a tradition, some people have to have a Megillah, where every single column in the Megillah, except of course the first one, start with the word Hamelech, the king, and so you on top of the king, you elaborate on some of the tagin to create a crown, and that's, the king with the crown at the top of the column. It sort of gives this sort of vibe and flavor and atmosphere to the Megillah, so that's something which is quite common. There is discussion that Paskim say you shouldn't touch the letters, and even within that, some people avoid it, some people don't. There's some variations of that tradition as well. But so that's basically what we have to say about this topic. Any questions before we close out? All right.